What is going on, guys? Vanity here, back with my complete guide to mastering audio. The contents of this tutorial will be as follows. We'll start with a quick disclaimer and then move into what mastering actually is. Chapter 1 will be the art of dynamic range. Chapter 2, loudness normalization. 3, compression. 4, equalization. 5, depth and dimension. 6, loudness metering. And finally 7 will be clipping, soft clipping and oversample clipping. Each of the chapters contains several subsections within. Times for both are listed and linked in the pinned comment below. This is obviously a fairly long tutorial, and it's definitely going to get technical in a few places, predominantly the first couple of chapters. Think of this video as a buffet. Browse the list of chapters below, pick the ones that are most relevant, and discard the rest. For now. If you're looking for the minimum effective dose, I'd recommend the compression, equalization, depth and dimension, and loudness metering chapters. A quick side note too, for recently surpassing 10,000 subscribers, I wanted to give something away just to show my appreciation and say thank you to you all. I'm running a giveaway with a first, second and third prize ranging from an audio interface, a pair of headphones and a MIDI controller. The link for which is in the description below, and yes, the competition is free to enter. Just a disclaimer right at the start of this video, this tutorial is heavily researched, which in itself does seem to be rare on YouTube these days. I do not claim to own anything in this video as my own, as it's simply a collection of research and information taken mainly from books, fellow engineers, and a little bit of my own experiences. Much of the foundational information in this tutorial, such as the definitions and principles, have been taken from Bob Katz's brilliant book, The Art and Science of Mastering, which I'll definitely recommend you all read. I wanted to base this tutorial around the book, as Bob Katz has already written the complete guide to mastering, but it's largely unheard of among producers. Perhaps this is because it contains a lot of information that only applies to mastering engineers as opposed to music producers. The book is of course written for the former. With this tutorial, I've tried to take what I deemed as relevant to the producer and condensed it into a shortened version of the book that goes into more detail in certain sections to cater for all levels of experience. Anyone looking to become a mastering engineer should therefore read the book in its entirety after of course watching this tutorial. This whole video is also in written format over on my blog, which is again listed and linked in the description. I've included a couple of extra chapters in the blog post for some of the more technical details, as I couldn't find a chapter to place them in within this video. I will be following this tutorial up with a practical mastering guide inside of Ableton Live using only free and stock plugins. But this tutorial covers everything I think you need to know about the subject in order to effectively master your own compositions. So without further ado, please enjoy this complete guide to mastering audio. What is mastering? In a sentence, mastering is the art of compromise. What do I mean by this? Well, changing anything in mastering affects everything, as any processing is applied across the entire mix. This makes mastering the art of compromise, of knowing what is sonically possible and then making informed decisions about what is the most important for the music. A mastering engineer requires the same ear training as a mixing engineer, though the mastering engineer becomes expert in the techniques for improving complete mixes, while the mixing engineer specializes in improving the mix at the level of the individual events that make up the whole. Mastering requires us to develop new skills since it is concerned with overall mixes rather than individual instruments. Chapter 1. The Art of Dynamic Range. Before we can dive into the specifics of mastering, it's important we understand the most critical factor in the subject: dynamic range. Even if you know and understand what dynamic range is, I guarantee that you'll learn something new in the next few minutes. Any experienced mastering engineer will tell you that they begin mastering with the loudest part of the song. Why? Because loud passages accentuate those peaks that the ear is most sensitive to. Equalization choices that are pleasing during a soft passage may sound harsh during a loud one. The term dynamic range refers to the difference between the loudest and the softest passages of a recording. It should not be confused with loudness or a program's average level. Ironically, it wasn't until the year 2012 that we officially agreed on how to measure dynamic range. Before that, we had no measurement method to deal with the following issues. If a song fades out to silence, can we claim it has 90 decibels of dynamic range? Does adding a spoken word introduction to a hard rock song give it 40 decibels of dynamic range instead of only 5? Does a 10-second soft passage in a pop song negate the effect of its otherwise constant loudness? The answer to all three of these questions is of course not. So how can we judge the effectiveness of a brief soft passage in the middle of a highly compressed song? The answers lie in two groundbreaking developments. The first is the International Audio Standard for Measuring Loudness, ITU's BS 1770-3, which tells us how to measure both our program's integrated loudness, also known as program loudness, and its true peak level. It's set by the International Telecommunication Union, or ITU for short. The second breakthrough is the European Broadcasting Union's recommendation R-128, which defines our program's loudness range. This is the first formal definition for how to measure dynamic range. In this tutorial, I'm going to refer to dynamic range as the latter, EBU's R128 definition of loudness range. A musical work that includes soft and loud passages usually sound more natural and can sound more exciting than one that does not. The typical measured LRA of a popular music recording is only 6 to 8 decibels. In fact, in 2012, Rudolf Ortner, a master's student in audio at the time, produced a comprehensive thesis that measured and statistically analysed over 10,000 charting popular music recordings made between 1951 and 2011. Ortner determined that the medium LRA of popular music has constantly been around 6 decibels plus 1 decibel minus 2 decibels for each of the past 60 years. This means that popular music producers have been very consistent in the dynamic range that they judge to be suitable. But it does not mean that there was no loudness race. On the contrary, other statistics uncovered by Ortner reveal the shocking extent of this race. Furthermore, Ortner determined that producers have held soft passages of popular music around 5 to 7 decibels below the program level, with some variances. Macrodynamics and Microdynamics. Dynamics can be divided further into two categories. Macrodynamics, which is the loudness differences between sections of a song or song cycle, measured by LRA, and microdynamics, which is the music's rhythmical expression, transient quality, or bounce, which involves the music's short-term peaks. Dynamic processors such as compressors, expanders, etc. can affect the music's microdynamics as well as its macrodynamics. Manual gain riding can only affect the music's macrodynamics since we can't move a fader fast enough to affect the short-term peaks. But we can affect microdynamics by editing very short movements. The micro and macro manipulations work hand in hand, and many good compositions incorporate both microdynamic changes, such as percussive hits or instantaneous changes, as well as macrodynamic, like crescendos and decrescendos. Think of a music album as a 4-course meal. The progression from soup to appetizer to main course and dessert is the macrodynamics. We'll now further explore on the macrodynamics. The art of reducing, or compressing, dynamic range. The dynamics of a song or song cycle are critical to creative musicians and composers. Our quality reference should be the sound of a live performance. We should be able to tell by listening if a recording will be helped or hurt by modifying its dynamics. Even when mastering largely constricted genres like hip-hop, using the dynamics of live performance should be your standard. In a natural performance, the choruses should sound louder than the verses, ensembles louder than soloists, and the climax meaningfully louder than the rest. Many recordings have gone through several stages of compression of dynamic range, and indiscriminate or further dynamic reduction can easily push the clarity and the impact downhill. However, usually the recording medium and intended listening environment simply cannot keep up with the full dynamic range of real life. So the mastering engineer is often called upon to raise the level of soft passages and or reduce loud passages, which can be done by manual compression, moving a fader up or down, or manipulating gain in a DAW. We may reduce dynamic range when the original range is too large for the typical home environment, or to help make the mix sound more exciting, fatter, more coherent, to bring out inner details, or even out dynamic changes within a song if they sound excessive, which is definitely a subjective judgment. Experience tells us when a passage is too soft. The ear's sensitivity changes with the context, so a soft introduction located immediately after a loud song may have to be raised, but a similar soft passage in the middle of a song may be just fine. Meter readings are fairly useless in this regard. how soft is too soft? As case in point, the engineers at Lucasfilm discovered that having a calibrated monitor gain and a dubbing stage with a very low noise floor does not guarantee that a film's mix will translate to the theatre. During theatre test screenings, some very delicate dialogue scenes were being eaten up by the air conditioning rumble and audience noise in a real theatre. So they created a calibrated noise generator labelled popcorn noise, which could be turned on and added to the monitor mix whenever they wanted to check a particularly soft passage. The art of increasing dynamic range. Increasing dynamic range can also make a song sound more exciting by using contrast or by increasing the intensity of a peak. The key to success here is to recognise when an enhancement has become a defect. Musical interest can be enhanced by variety, but too much variety is just as bad as too much similarity. Passages that are too loud compared to the average can disturb listeners, especially those playing music quietly as background, which sadly seems to be becoming more the norm. Another reason to increase dynamic range is to restore, or attempt to restore, the excitement of dynamics that were lost due to multiple generations of compression or tape saturation. The 4 varieties of dynamic range modification. We always use the term compression for the reduction of dynamic range and expansion for its increase. There are 2 varieties of each: downward compression and upward compression, and downward expansion and upward expansion. Downward compression is the most popular form of dynamic modification. It brings high-level passages down. Limiting is a special case. It is downward compression, but with a very high ratio. Examples include just about every compressor or limiter you have ever used. Downward compression can easily be done manually by simply lowering the level of loud passages without introducing the artifacts of compression processors. Note that compression processors can decrease microdynamics, while manual compression does not. Upward compression raises the level of loud passages. This too can be done manually or through a processor. For example, the automatic gain control, which some broadcasters use to make things louder, is a type of compressor frequently used in consumer camcorders, while pumping and breathing artifacts have given automatic gain control a bad name. Downward expansion is the most commonly used type of expansion. It brings low-level passages down further. Most downward expanders are processors employed to reduce noise, hiss, or leakage. A delicate noise gate is a special case. That is, downward expansion with a very high ratio. Upward expansion takes high-level passages and brings them up even further. This can be done manually, thereby increasing macrodynamics, or with a processor called an upward expander, which can increase both macro and microdynamics. Upward expanders are relatively rare. In skilled hands, they can be used to enhance dynamics, increase musical excitement, or restore lost dynamics. The art of manual gain riding, macrodynamic manipulation. During mixing, it is difficult to simultaneously pay attention to the internal balances and the dynamic movement of the music from section to section. For example, verses and choruses. Sometimes engineers inadvertently lower the master fader during the mix to keep it from overloading. If performed during a build, this will strip the climax of its impact. In mastering, we can enhance a well-balanced rock or pop mix by taking the dynamic movement of the music where it would like to go. Delicate level changes can make a big difference. It's amazing what a single decibel can accomplish. It's also important to make sure that the client's own level change was not intentional before attempting a correction. The art of changing internal levels of a song. How and when to move the fader. Artistic level changes can really improve a production, but they need to be made in the most musical way. To this end, internal level changes are least intrusive when performed manually by raising or lowering the fader as little as 1/4 of a decibel at a time, as opposed to using processors such as compressors or expanders, which tend to expose that action. When riding the gain, aim to just augment the natural dynamic flow. If the musicians are trying for upward impact, pulling the fader back during a crescendo can be detrimental, since it will diminish the intended impact. Extra soft passages require special attention. If the highest point in the song sounds just right after processing, but the intro sounds too soft, it's best to simply raise the intro, finding just the right way to restore the gain using one or more of these approaches. A quick edit and level change at the transition between the raised level intro and the normal level body. This can have a nice effect and be the least intrusive. If that doesn't sound good, try a long gradual lowering of the gain, which might occur at the end of the intro or slowly during the first verse of the body. If that doesn't work, then after the raised intro, try a series of quarter or 1 decibels downward edits, taking the sound down step by step at critical moments. This is useful when we don't want the listener to notice that we're cheating the gain back down and we may be forced to work against the natural dynamics. Retaining dynamic impact while reducing dynamic range. Some soft passages must be raised, but if the musicians are trying to play something delicately, pushing the fader too far can ruin the effect. The artist to know how far to raise it without losing the feeling of being soft, and to find the ideal speed to move the fader without it being noticed. In a DAW, physical fader moves are replaced by crossfades, or by drawing gain changes on an automation curve. The mastering engineer's aim is to be invisible. If the sound is being audibly manipulated, the job has not been done properly. A technique for decreasing dynamic range in the least damaging way is to lower the gain at the end of the preceding soft passage before the loud part begins. This is of course if we need to take a loud passage down. Look for a natural dip or decrease in energy and apply the gain drop during the end of the soft passage before the crescendo into the loud part. In other words, take down the level during a decrescendo, not during the loud passage that follows. That way, the loud passage will not lose its comparative impact for the ear judges loud passages in the context of the soft ones. Before I dig into the compression, equalisation, and depth and dimension tips and tricks, there's one more important concept that we need to first understand, as it will influence our choices in these categories, and it's loudness normalization. What is loudness normalization? Loudness normalization is the process of correcting the level of a program to a standardized target level. It is a simple gain or attenuation value, a level control which can be applied on broadcast or in the case of a media player like iTunes just before hitting play on the selected song or movie. For example, the EBU has defined the standard target for program loudness for both European radio and television as -23 LUFS plus 1 dB. The ATSC has defined a -23 LUFS plus 2 decibels, so the two standards are reasonably compatible. The target is genre neutral. It applies to all genres from spoken word to heavy metal. A standardized measure of loudness. The loudness revolution has arrived, and it's widely implemented throughout European broadcast networks and after December 13th, 2012 on US television. This will eventually affect all recorded sound in specific ways. In Europe, both TV and radio sound levels are measured by the international ITU standard BS.1770-3 and are regulated by the European Broadcast Union's recommendation R128. In the US, levels are regulated by the Advanced Television Systems Committee, ATSC for short, A85 specification. The European standard was adopted to obtain more consistent sound levels and encourage better sound quality by requiring much less dynamic processing. In the US, however, the driving factor has been to eliminate loud television commercials via the CARM Act, which was passed by the US Congress, Commercial Advertisement Loudness Migration Act. But the result is similar, provided that stations do not cut corners and implement shocking processing instead of regulating levels. Some of the measures defined by these standards appear on this diagram of a recorded audio file. The purple area represents the loudness range of this recording from the softest to the loudest passage, with its average loudness, also known as program loudness, in LUFS at the marked line. Its crest factor, which is the peak to average ratio, is measured from its average loudness to the highest peak of the material, which is at the top of this yellow area. Its headroom, as it could be defined, is the maximum potential crest factor, the distance between its average loudness and full scale. For example, if a recording's average loudness is -23 LUFS and its maximum peak level is -3 dBFS, then it has a 20 decibel crest factor and 23 decibels of headroom. Until now, headroom has been defined as the distance between the highest peak level and the full scale, or peak headroom, but now that the ITU has defined the standardized average loudness, it makes sense to define headroom in relation to loudness. The ratio between the average and the peak level of a recording directly affects its sonic character, but the effect depends on the style of music. In percussive music, for example, having a relatively large distance between the average and the peak level is important because percussive music includes not only drums, but also the tap of a guitarist's hand on his guitar body for musical emphasis. But But peak to average ratio is not that important in non-percussive music, which includes everything from string quartets to solo vocal recordings. Engineers manipulate peak to average ratio, or crest factor, for special effect by using compressors. Sample drum sets used in hip-hop are often highly compressed, with little peak energy above the average energy, so they can be made to sound very loud, and the subsequent distortion is part of the language associated with that musical genre. Peak normalization exaggerates loudness differences. It is natural to have programs and musical styles with different peak to average ratios and different sound. The prelim is that ever since the CD was invented in Sierra 1980, engineers have been trying to peak all recordings to digital full scale, which causes extreme loudness differences between percussive and non-percussive recordings and between processed and unprocessed recordings. This diagram compares the level of a string quartet and a symphony orchestra, both adjusted until their peaks hit full scale, which is called peak normalization. The symphony orchestra needs much more peak headroom to accommodate all of the momentary transients in the material, so peak normalization exaggerates the loudness difference. It makes the string quartet sound 10 to 14 decibels louder than the symphony. This is especially problematic when constructing playlists in iTunes. Peak normalization encourages overprocessing. Peak normalization also encourages program producers to compare or limit material in order to gain a loudness advantage. Even classical music producers have asked mastering engineers to peak limit and raise the level of their program so it won't sound quiet than a competing product. Peak limiting can easily cause the sound quality to deteriorate. Small amounts of peak limiting may be inaudible to some, but critical listeners will notice the deterioration of the clarity, the increase in the distortion, and the softening of the transients. Hard rock, metal, pop music, and other heavy processed genres have suffered during the loudness race. Drums, particularly snare and bass drums in hip-hop, have lost their punch. There's just not enough room in this tiny yellow area to properly express the transients, as you can see on the diagram here. Loudness normalization. Radio and TV have always regulated sound levels to produce a more consistent consumer experience. They have also engaged in loudness wars to gain higher ratings. In the past, broadcast loudness regulation was done by using severe processing and very strong compressors and limiters that squash the sound, causing severe distortion. The distortion multiplies when already distorted, hyper-compressed CDs are played on the radio. During the days of analog broadcasting, there was probably no way to stop the practice of severe processing, but digital techniques permit all broadcast audio, except obviously for live broadcasts, to be stored in computer files which can be analysed ahead of time and adjusted to the consistent loudness by simply adjusting their gain without further processing. Sonically, this offers a big advantage over the old way. Once the standard organisations defined a loudness measurement standard and regulations came into place, true loudness normalisation was underway in broadcast. For example, the classical and pop recordings the diagram is showing here can be loudness normalized by placing each of their average loudness points at the same target level as this diagram shows. The influence of radio broadcasting on music production techniques. Radio broadcasting has always had a profound influence on the sound of music and how we produce it. It is believed that the advent of loudness normalization radio production in Europe is starting to have an effect on how we all produce and engineer music. Consider this scenario. Whether you are producing popular or classical music, EBU digital broadcasts normalize all recordings to -23 RUFS if they are not already at this level. A well-managed US TV or European digital broadcast network does not need to change the sound of your recordings. They maintain its crest factor since they use very little processing. For example, let's imagine that an acoustic music song was originally mastered with a crest factor of 11 decibels, which you can see here is figure A, and everyone is happy with the sound. One contributing factor is that the relatively high crest factor influences its clarity and impact. However, artist management decides it sounds too low compared to the competition. Keep in mind that the management need not be concerned about how loud the song will sound on the radio, which broadcasts everything at the same average loudness, but they do want to impress the radio program's director via loudness when the program directors audition the CD for the first time. So they ask the mastering engineer to make it louder. He adds 2 decibels of peak limiting, which raises the average level 2 decibels and reduces its crest factor, figure B. For better or worse, this becomes the release CD, not just for the program directors to hear one time, but for posterity. When this CD is broadcast on US radio, its hot level interacts with the extreme processing, creating strong distortion, and the song loses impact and clarity, especially on typical car speakers. But it sounds no worse than any other hot CD on popular US stations. However, in European digital broadcasting, the song is not processed. The station simply lowers its average level to match their loudness standard of -23 LUFS. Figure C, and the sound is exactly like that of the release CD. Soon the producers discover that on European radio, their song doesn't sound as good as some of the competing songs. It has less impact and is less clear on the radio than some of its competitors with a lower CD level. In response, the producers released the original master as a new radio version, Figure D, which sounds much better on the digital radio without the extra peak limiting. There's more transient clarity, it's livelier, bigger, and better than its competition. All this because European radio has not processed the sound other than to normalise its loudness. Note that examples A and D should sound the same if the playback level is adjusted to be the same, but example D shows that a loudness normalized medium gives the producer the freedom to decide the sound quality he wants without causing an increased crest factor to run into the top of the medium. I'm not claiming that crest factor is the only or the most important influence on the sound character of any recording. It's just that in the ultimate days of the loudness race, crest factor has been reduced so much that it cannot help being a strong limiter. Incidentally, this new radio version also sounds better on US radio because it does not push the processor as far. Essentially, the producers have done an end run around the radio program director who picked their product when they gave him that hot CD. Now they can make it sound better on the radio. This experience reveals one thorn in the side of the effort to end the loudness race: the manner in which program directors evaluate artist CDs. They often put in one CD, listen for a very short time, and then put in another with little attention to its musicality or dynamics. Under those conditions, there's no question they are influenced by the loudest disc, forgetting that the loudest disc sounds worse on radio. It loses the race. If the disc is not loud enough to meet their preconceptions, they reject it. So the program director becomes a major influence on the sound quality of our recorded product. If program directors switch to evaluating music using iTunes Soundcheck, that would make all the difference in the world. iTunes Soundcheck technology. A cross-genre iTunes playlist exhibits big loudness jumps, especially between older and newer material. The solution for iTunes, as for broadcast, is Loudness Normalization. Soundcheck is iTunes' Loudness Normalization technology. It can be enabled in the iTunes preference settings. From there on, it will work transparently and seamlessly. Upon playback, the gain of each file is adjusted to eliminate sudden increases or decreases in track-to-track sound level as you listen. The music files themselves are not altered in any way by this process, which is reversible. With Soundcheck activated, modern hip-hop can play next to classic rock, and dynamic material can sit effectively next to compressed material in any tailor-made playlist. Soundcheck on by default. I believe Soundcheck will be turned on by default in future versions of iTunes and Apple iOS devices, though Apple has made no announcements about this as of the upload date of this video. Soundcheck on by default will be a game changer. Although producers have no control over the playback loudness of their product, they can create a new product with much more control over its clarity, macrodynamics, microdynamics, and spatial characteristics. The word competition takes on a whole new meaning with loudness normalization. Life in the music world just gets better. When producers listen to their song on iTunes with Soundcheck turned on, they discover that over-processed material sounds worse. Nearly all music playback platforms are capable of loudness normalization. New cars come equipped with aux connections, and the aux and iTunes are rapidly replacing the compact disc player in the car and at home. Other playback systems and some digital music services, such as Spotify, are also using loudness normalization technology. The benefits of Soundcheck. During the mastering session, producers can rest assured that Soundcheck will maintain their albums as loud as any of its competitors. Soundcheck offers many advantages for both producers and consumers, such as producers can make choices about how much distortion or dynamic manipulation they want to apply without worrying that their recordings will sound softer than the competition. The mastering engineer does not have to combat severe compression by over-equalizing. Bass drums in hip-hop recover their boom, punch, and crack. Peak limiting and clipping return to optional creative tools, allowing drums to sound louder and more effective, since excessive processing can be avoided. Snare drums and snappy instruments sound lively again. The word headroom finally means something. Choruses sound louder than verses once again. Space and depth are restored. And music lovers can rediscover the sound of classic recordings, which no longer sound much too soft compared to contemporary pop recordings. Listeners play hip-hop and metal loudly, because that's how these genres are meant to be played. But over-compressing a modern hip-hop or metal album to make it sound louder is just band-aid. As soon as soundcheck is engaged, severely compressed pop material is revealed as sounding flat and lifeless, and all the weaknesses of over-processing become exposed. Once the efforts of hyper-compression are uncovered, a lot of producers and engineers will be scrambling to make music sound good again, not just loud. The only way to restore dynamic excitement is by remixing and/or remastering. So to protect your precious catalogue every time you have an album mastered, remember to produce an archive of high-resolution dynamic masters that can benefit from iTunes' soundcheck. Everything loud, then everything else. The intent of loudness normalization systems is to regulate loudness for the consumer as well as eliminate a loudness war, but don't bother to ask a producer to voluntarily make his production sound equal to its competition if he can make it sound louder. Loudness normalization systems store the loudness information of a song in metadata, which in Dolby's Dynorm system is in the hands of its producers. So any program producer can literally hack the metadata to make a song apparently louder. This includes discs encoded in Dolby Digital and Dolby True HD, resulting in a perversion of Dynorm's entire intent. Nearly all music DVDs and Blu-ray discs have been given a Dynorm value of 31, the highest gain, by the program producers. For all of these discs, the playback system applies the maximum possible gain, which makes a mockery of loudness normalization. There's no turning back the clocks once a single competing disc has been pressed and released with incorrect Dynorm. It sets off the war and lets the loudness genie out of the bottle. For these reasons, many popular music video discs have been produced with as much distortion as the hottest pop CDs. Soundcheck means no cheating. There's only one way to put the genie back in the bottle: use a secure normalization system. This marks an important distinction between Apple's Soundcheck and other systems. Soundcheck means no cheating. Soundcheck is a closed system, putting loudness normalization securely under the control of an independent third party. Apple is securely in control of the integrity of audio from delivery of the masters. A unique vendor encodes all the loudness metadata, protects that data, securely distributes, sells, and in the case of streaming, broadcasts the material. Big Brother may be watching, but his intentions are beneficial, protecting the interests of all music producers who might otherwise forge loudness data to their advantage. Apple does provide tools for producers to evaluate soundcheck metadata in advance. Engineers can make test encoders, see how the material sounds in comparison to the competition, and inspect the soundcheck values that will be given to their material. But this metadata cannot be submitted to Apple. They control the final encode and securely compute the loudness metadata. The soundcheck value Apple gets will be the same as the one you get by importing your music into iTunes. Noise is not a problem. With loudness normalization, system noise does not come up perceptibly, even though the audio levels of some products have been lowered. That's because listeners keep their volume controls at a reasonable constant gain. It's a myth to say that we have to up all the bits, since peak bits have little or nothing to do with perceived loudness or signal to noise ratio. Album normalization, now. Producers and mastering engineers adjust the levels of songs in an album according to how they feel. They do not regulate them to the same measured loudness. Adjusting all songs to the same loudness will be silly. Ballads would be the same level as rockers, and the slow, relaxed movements of symphonies would be just as loud as the final, bombastic movement. Even when a soft movement from an album is placed into a playlist with loud material, it's usually better to respect the original relationship of the soft piece to the loud numbers. When Frank Sinatra sings a ballad, it's supposed to sound a little softer. He can mix quite well in the same playlist with rockers in an album normalized system, as can be seen by this diagram. The dashed line here represents the average loudness of a song. In figure A, we combined Frank with the Beatles without any loudness normalization. Without normalization, the loudest song on this Sinatra album is as soft as the softest song on the Beatles album, because the albums have previously been peak normalized. Each album plays fine within itself, but in a mixed playlist, either Frank has to be turned up or the Beatles have to be turned down, so this mixed genre playlist doesn't work at all. In figure B, we perform a per track normalization, which adjusts each song level to the same loudness, the target level line. but the soft songs now sound way too loud. In fact, the album sounds compressed because songs that are intended to be soft are made loud. Consequently, the loud numbers aren't swinging as they should compared to the soft numbers. Frank and the Beatles perform together without any musicality. In Figure C, we perform album normalization, which adjusts the loudest song of each album to the target level. Now the loud songs of both performances are set the same and the soft songs fall into blissful proportion. Notice that the Sinatra loud song has a larger peak to loudness ratio than the Beatles loud song, so it proudly sounds more lively and open. The Beatles producers compressed the song to that degree for artistic purpose, but assuredly, once loudness normalization becomes a default, many producers will regret some of the compression choices they had made, as a lack of impact becomes painfully obvious. Now that we understand the art of dynamic range and loudness normalization, as well as how it will affect our masters, I'd like to move into what I'd consider as the main body of this tutorial: compression. For the first 2 or 3 years of my journey as a music producer, I, as many do, failed to really grasp the topic of compression, more specifically, when to deploy the tool and what the controls contained within one actually did. Compression is a tool that can change the inner dynamics of music by enlivening low and mid-level passages, enhancing rhythmic movement, or producing a stronger musical message. There's a great quote from Einstein that reads, "If you can't explain it simply, you don't understand it well enough." I've deployed this quote into the philosophy of these definitions. The harder ones will have the most simplistic definition I could come up with, followed by the complex, more technical explanation. Controls of the compressor. We'll start with threshold. Simply, the threshold is one word: level. The threshold of a compressor is the level at which gain reduction begins. Ratio. The ratio is the amount. A compressor's ratio describes the relationship between input and output above the threshold. For example, a simple compressor with a fairly gentle 2.5 to 1 compression ratio and a threshold at around -40 dBFS. 2.5 to 1 means that an increase in the input signal of 2.5 decibels will yield an increase in the output of only 1 decibel. Or for an input rise of 5 decibels, the output will rise only 2 decibels. Try to remember threshold as level and ratio as amount. Gain makeup. The gain makeup is a simple gain amplifier after the compression section that allows the average level of the material to be raised while the loudest passages are still brought down. Gain reduction. The gain reduction meter in a compressor tells us when the signal has exceeded the threshold and how much the compressor is reducing the gain of the signal. Knee. The portion of the curve near the threshold is called the knee, which marks a transition between unity gain and compressed output. In limiters, the knee should be very sharp. Compressors can have hard or soft knees. Soft knee refers to the rounded knee shape or a gentle transition, and hard knee refers to a sharper shape where the compressor reaches full ratio immediately above the threshold. A soft knee can also sweeten the sound of a compressor near the threshold. For those models of compressors that have only hard knees, some of the effects of a soft knee can be simulated by reducing the ratio or raising the threshold, which will result in less action by the compressor. Attack time. Attack time is the time it takes for a compressor to implement a full gain reduction after the signal has crossed the threshold. Because digital compressors can react with essentially infinite speed, a digital compressor set to 100 milliseconds may sound similar to an analog compressor set, say, to 40 milliseconds. The method the designer uses to define attack is not standardized, so it is not possible to compare specific attack times between brands. It's better to remove all labels besides slow and fast and just listen. With digital compressors, typical attack times used in music for mastering can range from 30 milliseconds to 300 milliseconds or even longer on some occasions, with the average time used being probably around 100 milliseconds. But go by your ears, not the numbers. To help set your attack time, listen to the percussive and transient quality of the music. Shorter attack times soften transients and produce a more closed sound. Longer attack times let the music breathe and reveal more of the percussive transients. Release time. Release time or recovery time is how long it takes for the signal to return to unity gain after it has dropped below the threshold. Typical release times used in music range from 50 to 500 milliseconds or as much as a second or two, with the average being somewhere around 150 to 250 milliseconds. The terms short or fast with attack or release times are used interchangeably, as are slow and long attack and release times. Manufacturers may measure times to 90% of gain reduction or use another empirical approach to define them. Release time is probably the single most influential setting affecting the sound of a compressor. Super fast release times can help to make the sound appear unrelentingly loud and aggressive, and slow release times are more gentle on the sound. Analog optical compressors have a fast initial release and then a slow final release, which yields a more gentle aspect and a bloom to the sound. VCA compressors produce the reverse effect, which can aid in producing a more aggressive sound quality. Digital compressors attempt to emulate one or the other of these analog characteristics, or to be switchable to do either. A good starting point for a digital compressor on mixed music is to set the attack time to about 100 milliseconds and the release to about 250 milliseconds. Then listen and adjust. If you want a more punchy, aggressive sound, shorten the release slightly and, if useful, shorten the attack from there. Higher ratios, harder knees, and greater gain reduction also contribute to a more aggressive sound, but be careful, when a parameter is turned too far, the sound loses its definition and punch. As with any process, less is more. With digital limiters, release time is very important. The faster the release time, the more invisible the limiter can be. It jumps in, quickly controls the transients, then gets out of the way. The fastest digital limiters have a release time of only 1 millisecond. However, super fast release times can cause significant distortion. This is why most successful digital limiters have an auto release control, which slows down the release time if the duration of the limiting is greater than a few milliseconds. The effective release time of an auto release circuit can be as short as a couple of milliseconds or as long as 50 to 500 milliseconds. All of this is intended to make the digital limiter as invisible as possible. Part of the sonic aggressiveness of a fast release time comes from the distortion at low frequencies that can occur if the release time is too fast. Look ahead. The preview or look ahead function allows very fast or even instantaneous attack time, which is especially useful in a peak limiter to prevent overloads. This unit can effectively react to the transients before it has even occurred. This requires a delay line, so analog processors do not have a look ahead. When there is a look ahead, the attack time can be as short as we desire, controlling any peak that concerns us. Look ahead is only relevant when we want a short attack time, since if we want a long attack time, then we probably also want to let the initial transients pass through. So look ahead is probably unnecessary for attack times longer than about 10 milliseconds. Crest factor control. Some compressors provide a crest factor control expressed in decibels or a range from RMS or full average to quanti peak through full peak. This means that the compressor can be set to act on the average parts of the music, the peak parts, or somewhere in between. Compressors with RMS characteristics sound more natural because they correspond with the ear's sense of loudness. But one of the best sounding compressors out there is peak sensing. When the crest factor control is set to peak, short transients tend to control the action, and at RMS, more continuous sounds control it. Compressors with unique characteristics. A subject I see discussed online mainly by producers who are new to music production is the difference between different compressors. Perhaps they've seen a masterclass in where an engineer may use different digital or analog compressors throughout a mix, and they're unsure as to why this is the case. Part of the fun in using compressors is discovering the specialities of different brands and models. Even with the same settings, some are smooth, some are punchy, some nicely fatten the sound, and others make it brighter, harder, or more percussive. This is often due to the differences in the curve or acceleration of the time constants, the attack and release times, how the device recovers from gain reduction, and whether the gain returns to unity on a linear, logarithmic, or even at irregular curve. Analog compressor designers choose from several styles of gain manipulation. The most common are FET, Field Effect Transistor, Optical, abbreviated Opto, VCA, Voltage Controlled Amplifier, Vari-MU, PWM, Pulse Width Modulation, and their various subcategories. Digital designers may emulate their characteristics, as in the Wave Renaissance series of digital compressors that have both opto and electro models. As mentioned before, in opto, the release time slows down for the last portion of the release, while in electro, it accelerates. Electro can yield a more aggressive sound, while opto is good for gentle, easygoing purposes. Analog optical compressors are great on vocals in tracking or mixing, but not as good for aggressive mastering of overall program material because they are generally too slow. However, digital opto models can be faster than their analog counterparts. Generally, analog optical models are more suitable for gentle mastering. Multiband processing. For most downward compression purposes, multibands are rarely needed. 1 or 2 bands are usually enough. However, splitting a compressor's signal into multiple bands avoids the problem of modulation with a single sidechain, since compression in one band will not affect another band. For example, the vocal will not pull down the bass drum or vice versa. This is perhaps the biggest selling point of multiband, because with the same amount of gain reduction, it can sound superior to wideband or sidechain equalization. The action can be made very invisible. Also, a higher amount of compression at an average level can be achieved in a multiband with fewer interaction or clamping artifacts. Another advantage is that high frequency transients can be left unaffected while compressing the mid-range more strongly, producing a brighter, snappier sound than a single band unit. But when the thresholds are set aggressively, loud action in one frequency band can dynamically change the overall tonality, producing a non-cohesive sound, especially if all bands are moving different amounts throughout the song. The multiband device's virtues permit louder average levels than were previously achievable, making it the most powerful but also potentially the most deadly audio process ever invented. Deadly because multiband compression fuels the loudness race. The technique has been hyped as a cure for all ills, which it is not, and can easily produce a very unmusical sound or take a mix where it doesn't want to go. When multiband processing is used, the line between equalization and dynamic processing becomes nebulous, because the output levels of each band form a basic equalizer, and if the bands have different thresholds, then they affect the tonality dynamically. Use standard equalization when instruments at all levels need alteration, or use multiband compression to provide spectral balancing at different levels. This is a form of dynamic equalization, so depending on one's point of view, a multiband compressor can be looked upon as a dynamic equalizer. Use multibands as a last resort. Fix the disease at its source, not with a multi-band-aid in mastering. Limiters. Just a quick side note in case anyone is wondering why limiters do not have their own chapter. Limiting is a type of compression. A limiter is a compressor. However, not all compressors are limiters. Limiters have a very high ratio, typically 20:1 all the way to infinity to 1. Moving on to equalization. Introduction to EQ in mastering. As far as music production is concerned, equalization is really just a fancy word for tone control, a device that can cut or boost particular parts of the audio spectrum. EQ can be used to create new tonalities and to help correct or equalize problems that occurred in the recording chain, though you should always strive to fix such problems first. There are 3 main controls you'll be using on an equalizer. Gain. Once you've pushed in a band, the first control you should tweak is the gain control. The EQ has no effect without some gain reduction or addition, no matter what you do with the other controls. Gain determines how much of a certain frequency is added or removed. It is the vertical axis on the EQ graph, and the taller it is, the more that frequency is being added. Q. Q determines how wide or narrow the EQ band is. A setting of 0 will pretty much encompass the entire spectrum depending on your gain amount, while a setting of 10 will only affect a very small range of frequencies. The third control is frequency. This determines which frequency the band affects. How we use an equalizer in the mastering stage can differ greatly from how one is used during mixing. I'd now like to look at some equalization principles and techniques that are common in mastering. An EQ technique used in mastering can be crucially different from an apparently similar technique used in mixing. For example, when mastering, adjusting the low bass of a mix will affect the perception of the extreme highs. Similarly, if a snare drum sounds dull but the vocal sounds good, then the voice may suffer when you try to equalize for the snare. These problems occur even between different elements in the same frequency range. During mixing, bass range instruments that exhibit problems in their harmonic range can be treated individually, but in mastering their harmonic range overlaps with the range of other instruments. Another key to effective mastering is that everything starts with the mid-range. The fundamentals of the vocal, guitar, piano, and other instruments must be correct or nothing else can be made right. Parametric and Shelving. There are 2 basic types of equalizers, parametric and shelving, named after their characteristic curves. Parametric EQ, invented by George Masonberg in 1967, is the most flexible curve, providing 3 controls: center frequency, bandwidth, level boost or cut. The parametric curve, also known as the peaking or bell curve, is also the most popular EQ shape used in mastering because it can be used surgically to remove certain defects, such as an overly resonant bass instrument, or enhance narrow ranges of frequencies. By comparison, shelving equalizers are more popular in mastering than in mixing, since they provide boosts or cuts to the entire spectrum below or above a selected frequency and can alter the tonality of the entire mix. Gentle equalizer slopes almost always sound more natural and less harsh than sharp ones, so Q values of 0.6 and 0.7 are therefore very popular in bell shapes and gentle slopes in shelving shapes. Higher or sharper Qs greater than 2 are used surgically to deal with narrow band resonances or discrete frequency noises, though we must listen for artifacts of high Qs such as ringing. Finding the right EQ frequency for dipping resonant notes. There are two techniques for finding a problem frequency that is resonating and must be dipped. The classic approach is to focus the equalizer directly, starting with a large boost and a fairly wide or low value Q. Sweep through the frequencies until the resonant is most exaggerated. Then narrow the Q to be surgical and finally dip the EQ the amount desired. It is, however, very difficult to sweep in the bass region because the distance between F sharp and G is only 3 Hz, while in the mid-range, the distance is 22 Hz. We've all heard the phrase one-note bass, and there's a reason why this problem occurs. Many rooms have standing wave problems in the bass that give the mix engineer the wrong impression that a note is too weak, so we boost it unnecessarily. The cure for one-note bass on the mastering side is quite delicate. We have to construct a bell filter that's only a few hertz wide. Narrow filters can ring, so be exceptionally careful. EQ, Ying and Yang. As I stated in the introduction of this video, mastering is a compromise. With equalization used in the mastering stage, it's important to remember the yin and the yang. Contrasting ranges have an interactive effect. For example, adding low frequencies makes the sound seem duller and reducing them makes it seem brighter. Adding extreme highs between 15 and 20 kHz makes the sound seem thinner in the bass and lower mid-range, and vice versa. A slight dip in the lower mid-range around 250 Hz reduces warmth and has a similar effect to boosting in the presence range around 5 kHz. A thick vocal can be helped either by reducing the lower mid-range or by adding presence or both. Yin and Yang considerations allow us to work in either or both contrasting ranges, whichever is most effective. When the overall level is too high, pick the range you need to reduce. When an instrument exhibits upper mid-range harshness, pick the frequency range that will have the least effect on other instruments playing at the same time. Using Baxandall for air. The air band is the range of frequencies between about 15 and 20 kHz, the highest frequencies we can hear. The third and important shape that's extremely useful in mastering is the Baxandall. Hi-fi tone controls are usually modelled around this curve. Like shelving equalizers, a Baxandall curve is applied to low or high frequency boost or cuts. However, instead of reaching a shelf, the Baxandall continues to rise or dips if cutting instead of boosting. This gentle shape often meets the ear's desires better than a standard shelf, especially for whole mixes, which is why the Baxandall is very popular in mastering. Be careful when making high frequency boosts. They are initially seductive but can easily become fatiguing. The principle of yin and yang reminds us that the ear interprets a high frequency boost as a thinning of the lower mid-range or bottom end. In addition, when the highs come up, the cymbals, triangles and tambourines become louder, which changes the balance of rhythm to melody for better or worse. High pass and low pass filters. Although pass filters can be used to solve noise problems in mastering, they can also introduce problems of their own because they affect everything above or below a certain frequency range. High pass filters can reduce rumble, thumps, P-pops and similar noises. Low pass filters are sometimes used to reduce hiss, but since the ear is most sensitive to hiss in the 3 kHz range, a parametric dip around that frequency is more effective than a radical low pass filter. For hiss removal, we usually prefer specialized noise reduction solutions over static filters. The limitations and the potential of the recording. If you wait until the mastering stage to fix certain problems, this invites compromise because there is only so much that can be done in mastering. But sometimes mix engineers try to fix things that don't need repair or over-process a recording, only making it sound worse. They do this because the tool is available and it's tempting to use, their monitoring is misleading, or because of lack of experience. The same thing can happen to an inexperienced mastering engineer too. This is where it plays for the mixing engineer to consult with an experienced mastering engineer before the mix is done. There is little we can do to fix a recording where one instrument or voice requires one type of equalization and the rest require others. Comb filtering is a complex problem that is not easily cured with an equalizer. Besides, in mastering, EQ affects the entire mix, not just the offending instrument or voice. It's best to first discuss the problem with the mix engineer to see if he can address the offending track and remix it. If that's not possible, then possibly ask for a stem, or as a last resort, try an overall mastering EQ, for example, a lower mid-range EQ boost to help a vocal that sounds thin due to comb filtering, even if it only touches one band of the comb filter. A perfect mix needs no mastering processing at all. Because of this, don't automatically begin equalizing, but listen and evaluate first. Many recordings that sound great leave the mastering studio with no equalization or processing. Linear phase equalizers, the theory. All current analog equalizer designers and nearly all current digital equalizers produce phase shift when boosted or cut, that is, signal delay varies with frequency. The higher the Q, the more phase shift. This kind of filter will always alter the musical timing and wave shape, also known as phase distortion. Whenever you have to equalize, you will always alter the signal in both the time and frequency domains. There will always be a time artifact. In the analog styled equalizer, which is usually mathematically termed minimum phase, the alteration will be primarily to spread the signal downstream, i.e. it does not lead the original signal by much. A downstream modification translates into different delays at different frequencies, dispersing the original signal. In some cases, this effect is quite audible. If one uses a digital approach, one can either mimic the analog behavior or use a linear phase, aka constant delay filter. This filter will equally precede and follow the signal. Part of the filter may create a pre-echo effect, modifying the leading edge of the transients and signal changes. A high Q linear phase filter can introduce audible pre-echo in the short millisecond range. It's exactly like a floor bounce, but without the comb filtering. Anytime that a high Q filter is used, careful listening with both types of equalization may be necessary to decide which choice is best. If you're looking for an aggressive sound, perhaps minimum phase is your best choice. But if you're looking for a natural sound, particularly at high frequencies, linear phase is your best choice. Narrow band peaks and dips can be accomplished in linear phase, avoiding the smeary quality that occurs in minimum phase with sharp bands. The jury is still out on which type of equalizer is best for low frequencies. Mid-side mastering. The mid-side technique can be used to gain a bit more control over the separate elements in our recording. MS stands for mid-side or mono stereo. Mid-side recording techniques are favoured by many engineers for a number of reasons during the recording, mixing and mastering stages, and it's the last that we'll look at here. With some very simple maths, it's possible to encode the standard left-right stereo mixes to mid-side. You'll still have two channels, but instead of left and right, you'll now have control over the mid, that's anything panned centrally, and the sides, anything to the left or right lumped together. After independently processing or level balancing, the mid-side signal can be decoded back to left and right. Mid-side gives you a very different type of control during the mastering stage because new opportunities emerge. You could EQ or compress wide-panned elements such as guitars or effect returns without affecting typically central panned elements such as the kick, snare, bass or the lead vocal, for example. Listen carefully for mid-side trade-offs with experienced ears. When raising the mid-channel to increase the vocal, the stereo width narrows and vice versa. Changing the width alters the mids. Mix engineers who rely largely on near-field monitors often produce stereo-compromised mixes because listening on near-fields is like having a big set of headphones which exaggerates the stereo separation. Using mid-side to increase the width is initially attractive but can easily produce an unfocused, phasey or vague stereo image. Therefore, more than about 1 decibel of mid-side variation is usually a bad idea. Fletcher-Munson curve. I'd like to quickly mention the Fletcher-Munson curve, as to apply effective equalization, it's critical that we understand this interesting phenomena of human hearing. The Fletcher-Munson effect dictates that high frequency energy produces more loudness than low frequencies at the same sound pressure level. As the actual loudness changes, the perceived loudness our brains hear will change at a different rate depending on the frequency. For example, at low listening volumes, mid-range frequencies sound more prominent, while the low and high frequency ranges seem to fall into the background. And at high listening volumes, the opposite is true. The lows and highs sound more prominent, while the mid-range seems comparatively softer. Yet, in reality, the overall tonal balance of the sound remains the same, no matter what the listening volume. Here's a graph that illustrates the concept of the Fletcher-Munson curve. This is also in the blog post if you wish to get a better look at it, the link for which is again in the description. Using some of the techniques we've just gone over will definitely help you to achieve depth and dimension in your masters, but this subject requires its own chapter to really grasp what's possible and how to achieve it in the mastering stage. Depth and dimension. Depth, the front to back dimension in your mix, is another area where your mastering engineer can coax out a lot of hidden magic. But, as always, we can do the most to enhance the sense of depth in our mixes when there is some there to begin with. To bake plenty of depth into your mix, you first have to realise that not every sound should feel like it's glued to the front edge of the speakers. And once again, contrast is key to crafting a bold mix that feels like it lives and breathes in all three dimensions. Because when every sound is up front, nothing gets to take centre stage. Once you've internalised this idea, the second step is to master the specific tools and techniques that will allow you to bring some sounds closer and push others back. Use of reverbs, delays, compression and EQ can all be crucial in making some elements seem to step back while allowing other, more central elements to step forward. The perception of depth. At first thought, it may seem that depth in our recording is achievable by increasing the ratio of reverberant to direct sound, but it is a much more involved process. Our binaural hearing apparatus is largely responsible for the perception of depth, but recording engineers were concerned with achieving depth even in the days of monophonic sound. In the monophonic days, many halls for orchestral recording were deader than those of today. Why do monophonic recording and dead rooms seem to go well together? The answer is involved in two principles that work hand in hand. The first is the masking principle, and the second, the Haas Effect. The masking principle. The masking principle says that a louder sound will tend to cover, or mask, a softer sound, especially if the two sounds lie in the same frequency range. If these two sounds happen to be the direct sound from a musical instrument and the reverberation from that instrument, then the initial reverberation can appear to be covered by that direct sound. When the direct sound ceases, the reverberant hangover is finally perceived. In concert halls, our two ears sense reverberation as coming diffusely from all around us and the direct sound as having a distinct single location. Thus, in halls, the masking effect is somewhat reduced by the ear's ability to sense direction. In monophonic recordings, the reverberation is produced from the same source speaker as the direct sound, and so we may perceive the room as deader than it really is because of the directional masking. Furthermore, if we choose a recording hall that is very live, then the reverberation will tend to intrude our perception of the direct sound, since both will be reproduced from the same location, the single speaker. So there is a limit to how much reverberation can be used in mono. This is one explanation for the incompatibility of many stereophonic recordings with monophonic reproduction. The larger amounts of reverberation tolerable in stereo becomes less acceptable in mono due to the directional masking. As we extend our recording techniques to two-channel and eventually multi-channel, we can overcome directional masking by spreading reverberation spatially away from the direct source, achieving both a clear and warm recording at the same time. The Haas Effect. The Haas Effect can be used to overcome directional masking. Haas says that, in general, echoes occurring within approximately 40 milliseconds of the direct sound become fused with the direct sound. We say that the echo becomes one with the direct sound, and only a loudness enhancement occurs. A very important corollary to the Haas Effect says that the fusion and loudness enhancement will occur even if the closely timed echo comes from a different direction than the original source. However, the brain will continue to recognise the location of the original sound as the proper direction of the source. The Haas Effect allows nearby echoes up to approximately 40 milliseconds delay to enhance an original sound without confusing its directionality. We can take advantage of the Haas Effect to naturally and effectively convert an existing two-channel recording to a 4-channel or surround medium. When remixing, place a discrete delay in the surround speakers to enhance and extract the original ambience from a previously recorded source. No artificial reverberator is needed if there is sufficient reverberation in the original source. Here's how it works. Because of the Haas effect, the ear fuses the delayed with the original sound and still perceives the direct of the sound as coming from the front speakers. But this does not apply to ambience. Ambience will be spread, diffused between the location of the original sound and the delayed sound in the surround speakers. Thus, the Haas effect only works for correlated material. Uncorrelated material, such as natural reverberation, is extracted, enhanced, and spread directionally. Dolby Laboratories call this effect the magic surround, for they discovered that natural reverberation was extracted to the rear speakers when a delay was applied to them. Dolby also uses a left -R matrix to further enhance the separation. The wider the bandwidth of the surround system and the more diffuse its character, the more effective the psychoacoustic extraction of ambience to the surround speakers. Using frequency response to simulate depth. Another contributor to the sense of distance in a natural acoustic environment is the absorption qualities of air. As the distance from a sound source increases, the apparent high frequency response is reduced. This provides another tool which the recording engineer can use to simulate distance, as our ears have been trained to associate distance with high frequency roll-off. An interesting experiment is to alter a treble control while playing back a good orchestral recording. Notice how the apparent front to back depth of the orchestra changes considerably as you manipulate the high frequencies. Another important tool for the measurement of depth and dimension, as well as several other important characteristics of your composition, are loudness meters. Loudness metering. In this chapter, we'll take a look at loudness meters, how to use and interpret them, and their relevance to music production. The revolution in loudness normalized digital radio and TV has inspired a plethora of loudness meters in every shape and size to fit every taste. But because the ear and brain are complex, no meter can anticipate our ear's perceptions at every moment in time. For example, when mastering an album that has a tune with a soft, delicate ending, the beginning of the next tune usually sounds too loud. But if you play the middle of the latter tune for a moment, it doesn't sound too loud. And when you play its beginning again, it also sounds fine. You feel no need to turn it down. What's happening is that, in general, the ear does not react to absolutes, but it is very sensitive to contrasts. And because the ear says so, the beginning of the following tune is too loud, regardless of what the meter says. One solution is to try to increase the space between the tunes. Another solution is to slightly turn down the introduction of the next tune, just enough to reduce the disturbance on the ear, making sure that you can lead the listener smoothly on an upward journey through the next tune. This is why it is important to use meters, but not to depend on them. Your ears should always be your last port of call. Audio meter weaknesses. Because of the aural sensitivity to contrast, a sudden burst of loud sound in the midst of soft sounds has a much greater impact than something of equal intensity in the middle of other loud sounds. No meter can make this type of loudness judgment or substitute for a set of trained audio engineers' ears. Also, meters do not take into account the listening sound pressure level. Our ears are not flat, and depending on how loudly we're listening, meters may over or underestimate our sensitivity of low frequency sounds. Audio meter strengths. However, despite these shortcomings, meters are absolutely necessary. Our ears can be temporarily reset by listening to a loud passage for a long time, but a meter can help us verify that the soft part of an album is not too soft. Meters are very good at detecting a domino effect, wherein a tune becomes slightly louder than the previous one and the ear gets accustomed to the escalation. We must learn to work with the audio meter to take advantage of its strengths and to understand its weaknesses. In general, audio metering has matured greatly. It is far more effective now than it has been since the time of dawn for audio recording. Learning how to read loudness meters when both mixing and mastering your tracks can make the biggest difference to the overall balance, especially if you haven't got the best monitoring system in the world. I'm going to cover some of the most important terms you'll find on meters now, but I've made a much bigger list over on the blog post to go with this tutorial. It's listed and linked in the description below. Vox-Engo span controls. Because this plugin is free, as well as it being one of the best, I'm going to use it as the example. It's called Span, and it's made by Voxengo. The plugin is listed and linked in the description. I'd like to take you through some of the statistical information that Span displays, so you can better understand what's going on in your own compositions. RMS. The RMS indicator here displays an unweighted RMS signal power estimation. In simple terms, it displays the average level. It does this by taking an average of the level over a short window of time. RMS level gives us information that relates to our perception of volume. Our brain processes information during a short window of time to evaluate how loud something is in our environment. An RMS level is a way to attempt to give feedback about that. However, RMS doesn't relate directly to perception in the case that it doesn't take frequency content and balance it into account. I'll come back to RMS in just a second as it will tie in with the peak level display. I guess the clue is in the name. The peak level will display the level of signal from moment to moment. In the case of Span, the peak indicator displays a one sample output peak level. Both the RMS and peak readings are important, but for different reasons. Peak level tells us how close the signal is to the point of distortion. It's a way of helping us understand whether we have any headroom to bring the signal up without changing anything out about it and staying below the point of distortion. The relationship between the peak level and RMS level will vary widely depending on the dynamics of the mix and the genre of the music. That makes it hard to generalize too much. However, if I had to give you a general idea about where the RMS level should be sitting in respect to 0 dBFS, I would recommend -10 for any electronic music, certainly nothing under -12. But of course, if you can get it louder than -10, do by all means. I myself will usually aim for no more than -3 decibels of gain reduction on my limiter. Crest factor. This list is in no particular order, although I do regard peak and RMS as the two most important readings you should be paying attention to. The next in the list is crest factor, perhaps my favourite. The display you're looking at on the Span here is the max crest factor, which shows the maximum crest factor difference between the RMS and peak RMS values reached. Peak RMS value is not displayed anywhere on the user interface. There is also a 50 millisecond time window used to estimate the peak RMS value. You can add the RMS and the max crest factor values together to obtain a peak RMS value. But please note that when comparing the max crest factor value in Span to other plugins, the peak RMS time windows should be matched in the plugin comparison, or otherwise the readings will be different. Correlation meter. This panel contains a meter that shows average real-time correlation between two first input channels. A correlation meter, also known as a phase meter, can tell that something is amiss, and even indicate that some information in the left channel is out of time or out of phase with that in the right. The meter is marked from -1 at the left through to 0 in the middle and +1 at the right. 0 means random correlation. This means that the left and right channels are only randomly related to each other. A 0 reading can occur when the sound consists of stereo ambience, delay, or if there are two entirely different programs in the channels. +1 means that the sound is completely mono and that there is 100% correlation to all frequencies between the left and right channels. A constant reading of -1 means that the channels are correlated, but one channel is out of polarity with the other. In that case, it is also correct to say that all the elements in one channel are 180 degrees out of phase with the elements in the other at all frequencies. If the channels are partially out of phase, the meter will be to the right of the -1 position. Meter movement towards the middle is desirable. It tells you that there is a lot of random phase information in the stereo field and that the stereo image will likely sound rich and spacious. If the meter is slightly off its extremes, you'll know that there is some phase shift between the channels, but don't try to correct timing information unless all of the information in the left channel is out of time with that in the right. Additional metering jargon. When mastering, there will be other terms that you will come across when using different types of plugins to measure and analyze your composition. These will include sample peak versus true peak. The maximum possible sample peak or digital peak of a recording is defined as 0 dBFS, the level that real-world digital audio samples cannot exceed. This is why we call it full scale. Sample peak, the actual peak numerical value of the samples, was the traditional method of peak metering until recently. But sample peak is not a very effective measure of judging overloads because real-world devices such as digital audio converters, filtered processors such as sample rate converters, and any kind of lossy codec produce higher output levels than their input. Thus, a PCM signal can represent a signal that has higher amplitude than the highest PCM value. A more effective measure of protecting from overloads specified in BS 1770-3 is called true peak, achieved by upsampling methods. True peak is a measure, well actually an estimate, of intersample peaks, literally peaks between the samples, which will occur after some kinds of filtering. In practice, this means that recordings whose sample peak is at or below full scale may overload after further conversion or encoding. These over full scale peaks are known as 0 dBFS plus fields. In the absence of true peak metering, it is wise to keep sample peaks at or below -1 dBFS. If mastering studios ignore true peak, they will soon discover that the PMC recordings that sounding so good in the studio become congested or distorted after conversion, especially to a lossy format. A true peak meter does an effective job of predicting the output level of filtered processes such as digital audio converters and sample rate converters, but lossy formats are a special case. Lossy formats not only filter but also add noise, which increases the sample peak level and the intersample peak. Because of this, a true peak meter cannot predict what a codec will do, so be sure to measure the true peak level of the codec. The lower the bitrate of the lossy medium, the higher the amount of overload distortion, so be mindful of those lower bitrate broadcasters like satellite radio and some streaming services. Integrated momentary short-term loudness. Integrated loudness is the same as program level, which is the quantity you should be aiming for when taking a measurement of the whole program. The EBU has defined two other timescales for use with loudness meters. The first is momentary loudness, abbreviated M, which is the loudness you hear now. M is averaged over a 400 millisecond period, which corresponds well with the VU meters many of us use. The second is short-term loudness, abbreviated S, with a time window of 3 seconds. They perhaps should have come up with a different term because it is not obvious that short-term is longer than momentary. Loudness range. Loudness range, abbreviated LRA, is a well-defined statistical measure of dynamic range, essentially the difference between the highest and the lowest gated loudness values in a particular program. True peak level. Another term newly standardized by the ITU is an estimate of the peak level that will be encountered at the output of a DAC or any other filtered process such as a sample rate converter or SRC. It's abbreviated dBTP. Compare this to sample peak level, which is the peak value of the digital sample measured by traditional digital meters, but traditional digital peak meters are no longer recommended for program measurements. Headroom. The ITU standard permits us to define headroom in a more usable way than ever before. Headroom is the difference between the program loudness and the peak level capability of the medium, 0 dBFS. Peak to loudness ratio. Peak to loudness ratio, or PLR for short, is the ratio between the highest true peak, not exceeding 0 dB TP, and the long-term average loudness of the song or album in LUFS. There will be many more, but I feel these are the most essential. I've included the full list in the blog post for this video. Clipping, soft clipping, and oversample clipping. I'd like to finish this tutorial on the last element in the mastering signal processing chain, distortion. Distortion has been part of the language of music ever since the electric guitar was invented in 1931. It's important to realise that distortion and compression are tightly interrelated. More compression means more distortion means more compression. A distorted waveform has a higher average level with the sample peak level than a pure sine wave tone. Higher average level indicates more compression. The relationship between the two is called peak to average ratio or crest factor. The more compressed the sound, the lower the peak to average ratio. Peak to average ratio is an indicator of a recording's compression, clarity, microdynamics, and impact. The higher the peak to average ratio, the more headroom we leave for its peaks above the average, which means there's more room for the percussion to sound natural. However, the distorted recording sounds much louder because the average level of a recording governs its perceived loudness. Distortion usually generates more high-frequency information, which the ear perceives as louder. Digital clipping is the result of attempting to raise the level higher than 0 dBFS, producing a square wave, a severe form of distortion, also known as clipping the medium. Analog clipping is the result of overdriving an analog processor beyond its peak headroom. Analog clipping generally comes on gradually, while digital clipping becomes quite severe rapidly. Therefore, analog clipping sounds easier on the ear than digital clipping, but they are both forms of distortion. Clippers are specialized devices that electronically cut off momentary peaks out of the waveform to allow the overall loudness to be raised, which is a better sounding approach than just clipping the medium. Soft clipping attempts to do this only a little bit with less distortion. Digital peak limiting. Keep in mind that if every mastering engineer is already using peak limiting, every runner in the race has already taken steroids, so there is no performance advantage. 1 or perhaps 2 decibels of limiting may get the program level up without taking the sound quality downhill. More than that can easily produce wimpy, unclear, less effective sound quality. Carefully compare with less limiting and you may be surprised. When raising the level, listen, don't look at the loudness meter. Does this raised version actually sound louder, or just measure louder? Carefully compare this with less limiting and you may be surprised. Clipping. Clipping can add an edge, increasing apparent loudness and definition, but it can also have the opposite effect. Since clipping is a form of limiting without a defined attack or release time, it can be a lesser evil with less clamping effect than a peak limiter. But like limiting, it can rob a recording of impact and important microdynamics. At double sample rates, digital clipping produces less mid-band distortion and artifacts than at single sample rates. Be aware though, that what sounds loud due to clipping in the control room will sound very harsh once it hits the codec or FM radio station processor. You can't vault the laws of physics. Make sure you audition clipping through the codec. Alright, that concludes this complete mastering tutorial. Without a doubt, I'm sure to have forgotten to include something. I did my best to cover the essentials while giving you the philosophy and the why behind everything we've gone through. Learning how to do something is important, but the why is what ingrains it in your brain and allows you to recall it when you next need that piece of information. I'll be around in the comments, so leave any questions you have down below and I'll do my best to answer them all. As always, I hope you learned something new, and until next time, I'm out. Peace.